I want to welcome everyone to this lecture of the Introduction to Literature. You'll see two boxes on the slide in front of you. The slide on the left will remind you that literature is one of the forms of artistic expression, how human beings express their thoughts and feelings, their ideas about what it means to be human and their particular individual experiences of human life, along with the visual arts and the performing arts. The image on the right side of the slide, you may recognize if you look closely, the figures are in cuneiform, the writing system of ancient Mesopotamia. This is actually one of the tablets from which the Epic of Gilgamesh has been taken, was found and translated. It's a reminder that literature has been around for thousands and thousands of years. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, existing literary expressions, a story that tells not only a story about certain individuals, but expresses ideas about human existence. So with these ideas in mind, with these understandings of what literature is, the form of artistic expression that uses words to help us get at what it means to be human, we're going to proceed. There are a number of different ways that we could take the broad general category of literature and divide it up in order to understand it better. One of the most basic is to divide literature into poetry versus prose. Prose literature is literature that is constructed, composed in units of words that are pretty much exactly the way that we talk. In other words, this is literature that is written in sentences and paragraphs and uses language much the way we use it when we speak, and that the main focus of our attention with this kind of literature has to do with the sense of what is being said by the words. Poetry, on the other hand, is literature that is constructed, composed in different units than sentences and paragraphs. Even though it may have sentences in it, the main unit of construction in poetry is actually the line. And lines of poetry are then arranged in groups usually known as stanzas. And there are other groupings as well, but for the purposes of this course, this isn't a literature course after all, those are probably the best two things to keep in mind, lines and stanzas. And with poetry, it's not just the sense of what is being said, but it is also the form in which it is being said. Poetry is an art form in terms of the use of the language, and in a couple of slides we'll get into a little more about that. Another very typical way of dividing up the larger area of literature is into the three major genres or types of literature: poetry, drama, and fiction. And even though we've already looked at drama in an earlier lecture, I've placed it in the middle of the list because the list represents chronologically how and when different forms of literature began or were developed. Poetry is the earliest form of literature to develop, really developed out of songs and taking songs then and chanting and using words to set to different musical instruments. Fiction was the latest form of literature to develop. Fiction as we understand it in terms of short stories and novels and things of that nature really has only been around a very few hundred years or so, 2, 3, 4 centuries or so. Drama, which again we took a look at in another lecture, drama really kind of represents a bridge between these two. Drama emerged out of poetry, out of songs and poems that celebrated the works of great heroes or the deeds of the gods, and developed a story out of those. Drama can also be composed either in poetry or in prose. Most drama that is written these days is written in prose, in other words, language that sounds just like what we use when we speak. But in the very beginning, and for hundreds and hundreds of years, drama was composed in poetic lines. So let's continue on and begin to take a look at a little bit more at poetry. We can further divide poetry up into a number of different groupings. For our purposes, again, since this isn't a course in literature, we're going to divide poetry up into two basic categories: epic poetry and lyric poetry. Epic poetry gets its name from the Greek word epos, which is a song or a story of some sort that tells a great and grand big picture events, things of the gods, stories about heroic deeds or great historical events, historical deeds. It's also typically written in a certain type of language using certain forms and formulas. It was often chanted by bards who would compose the poetry in very small units called formulas, words that were fit together, and then they would take these small units of words called formulas and they would fit them together in longer units of lines, and in that process would tell a story. Actually, it's not unlike what rap artists do these days in composing some of their raps. It's a very similar kind of process. The other type of poetry that we will look at mostly this semester is lyric poetry. Lyric poetry, you might recognize the word, we use the word for the words that go with music in a song. Lyric poetry was poetry that was composed originally to be accompanied by an instrument called the lyre, L-Y-R-E, which was a kind of a stringed instrument, and rather than being chanted, lyric poetry was often sung, which makes sense given how we use the word today. Lyric poetry tends to be shorter than epic poetry. It also tends to be much more personal in tone. You might remember back when we were looking at Greek culture, Greek civilization, we looked at the lyric poetry, for instance, of Sappho, and also of Solon, who was a politician but also a poet, as he talked about some of his accomplishments. One of the main things that sets poetry apart from prose, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, is that poetry is intended to be not only about the sense but about the words themselves. The words represent part of the art. And poetry originally was intended to not be read silently the way many of us read today. Poetry was always intended to be read aloud so that the sound could be appreciated. Poetry is designed to sometimes represent things that it is actually describing. And so poets will often use combinations of letters, combinations of sounds together. When a poet uses a number of words in a line that begin with the same kind of sound, a lot of S's or a lot of hard C or K sounds or L or R sounds, that's called alliteration. Sometimes instead a poet will use lots of words with the same kind of vowel sounds, and that's called assonance, A-S-S-O-N-A-N-C-E. But the point is, when you're reading poetry, when you're thinking about poetry, you want to make sure that you're reading it aloud and thinking about how the combination of words produce certain kinds of sound effects that may have a lot to do with what the poem's trying to express. Along with the sound of the words, also the rhythm of how the words are combined together plays a large part in the overall artistic effect of poetry. Poetry is composed not only in lines, but also in shorter units referred to as feet. So a single unit would be known as a foot. And different combinations of sound combinations make up a foot. Now, what I mean by that is in English poetry and much of European poetry, we use what's called stress rhythm based on syllables. We have stressed syllables in our words. For instance, okay, in the word for, there's only one syllable, so it's just a long syllable. But instance we put the stress on the first syllable. We don't say instance, we say instance. So that combination of words, for instance, would have a short syllable for, a long syllable in, and a short syllable stance, for instance. And if I were using that poetically in a line, I would combine that with other groupings of syllables to produce patterns. And that's part of how much poetry, especially poetry in the Western tradition, has been composed. So it's not just the poet putting words together to make sense of ideas, but putting them together in a way that the very form of the words and the sound and the rhythm all together create the overall effect. For example, there are some well-known lines of poetry. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over a many forgotten volume of lore. That's a poem called The Raven. And you can hear the rhythm in that. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over a many forgotten book of lore. The poet who wrote that intended to combine those words in that order to create that kind of rhythmic effect to carry the reader through. And it makes it a very challenging endeavor to write poetry that way. Another well-known poem, line from American poetry about the ride of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. If you listen to the combination of those syllables, they're exactly the opposite of the other poem line, but you can still get the sense of how the rhythm works through that. And for many centuries, rhythm and sound were very, very important in the composition of poetry. And as you read poetry, as you think about poetry, if you choose to write about poetry for your project, you will want to pay attention to these two elements, the sound and the rhythm. In more modern forms of poetry over the last 100 years, maybe not quite 100 years, in the 20th and now the 21st century, there's been a lot more freedom in the use not to use rhythm or sound, or to use them in very different kinds of ways. But all poetry will in some way address these two elements in a way that a reader or a listener should be paying attention to. Another artistic way in which poets use language is to use language to express things that are not explicitly what the words themselves say. They may use figurative language, they may use imagery and symbolism. In other words, if they are referring to light in what they write about, they may be talking not just about physical light and the brightness of the sun or the moon, but the light itself may symbolize something else, for instance, knowledge or understanding. Sometimes they will use trees or colors to express ideas about life and birth and larger kinds of things, but they're using descriptions of physical objects or physical scenes, and even though they're describing something, they're really getting at something deeper than that. They're using figurative language, they're using images and symbolism. So one of the things as you read poetry, as you think about poetry, is to look at the images and scenes that a poet creates and think beyond, try to ask, what could this be describing other than the physical object that it seems to be right in the text of the poem. The last two elements to pay attention to, at least for our purposes, when you're looking at poetry, reading poetry, or writing about poetry, are subject and theme. Subject and theme both address the question, what's this poem about? But they address it from two distinctly different directions. The subject is the actual stuff that's being talked about in the poem. One American poet, Emily Dickinson, was very famous about writing about very common subjects, things like the house in which she lived and grew up in, going on a horseback ride or riding in a carriage or being out walking in her garden. And so that would be the subject of a particular poem or a group of poems. But theme gets at the deeper ideas that lie behind what the poet is talking about in terms of scene or objects and those kinds of things. Themes are concepts and ideas like love, sexuality, power, fear, death, mortality, which is a fancy word for life and death, rebirth, God, righteousness. All of those kinds of things represent themes that poets, using image and symbolism, talk about and try to express their ideas and feelings about, writing about certain kinds of subject matter. So, for example, to go back to our earlier example of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the subject of the Epic of Gilgamesh is a story about this king named Gilgamesh and events that are supposed to have taken place during his life. That's the subject of that epic poem. But there are themes in the Epic of Gilgamesh, things like human mortality, the briefness of life, suffering and grief, fame and heroic conquest, and all of these things are explored in the poem, while the story about the subject, Gilgamesh, and his friend Enkidu and their adventures are being talked about. So that's how the relationship between subject and theme happens. And as you're writing and thinking or reading poetry, you want to pay attention to both of these and the differences between them. Now, we're going to depart from talking about poetry, move into the area of talking about fiction. When we begin talking about fiction, many of the elements that we're going to look at will be the same elements that we talked about when we examined drama. And so we're going to be able to move through these fairly quickly, but you should pay attention to them again to make sure that you're aware of what they are, that you're thinking about them as you read a short story, as you read a novel or some other form of prose fiction, especially if you're going to write about a work of prose fiction literature as part of your project. You want to make sure that you're covering all of these elements. The first of this is plot. And of course, again, plot is simply what goes on, what takes place, what is the action that takes place in a story. And plot can further be looked at as there is often some exposition or some background story, or maybe not. Sometimes a story comes right into the middle of things and you don't have a lot of information about what's happened already. That's a fancy term called in medias res, M-E-D-I-A-S space R-E. In medias res, literally in the middle of things. And you have to read a while before you begin to find out who's involved in the story, find out what the backstory is, and so on. Now that's a choice that a writer has made, not to start off with once upon a time there was a prince and a princess, and to give you all the backstory ahead of time. Writers make those kinds of choices for reasons. And a good reader thinks about those reasons, asks, why did the writer do that? And that deepens a reader's experience of the story. So as you get into the plot, there will be rising action. In a plot, there's always something that's going on. There's a conflict. Someone is trying to do something, accomplish something. And they are either being helped to accomplish that, or they are being frustrated or prevented in accomplishing that. There are complications that come into play that keep them from doing what they want to, or introduce new surprising elements to the story. All of that has to do with different kinds of action. And there's rising action as the tension and the conflict increases, and that usually comes to a point of one or more climax or climaxes, where something's got to give. Something's got to happen to change the direction, because things just can't go on with this kind of tension, building. And there's usually some kind of a climax. Then there might be falling action, but rather than going immediately to an end in a work of fiction, which is usually longer than a drama or play, a writer may choose to start you on rising action again. And as you're reading along, it may literally be like riding a roller coaster, as you have rising action to a climax and falling action and rising action and falling action with a climax in the middle. And you go up and down and up and down and up and down as you follow all of this until you get finally to the end of the story, where there might be a resolution, a resolving of things, and whatever the conflict has been gets solved, or it might just cut off and leave you hanging. Sometimes that's very frustrating. Sometimes that's kind of cool and kind of satisfying. Depends on whether the writer does it well or not. Because after all, sometimes in life, things don't get resolved comfortably or conveniently. And good writing sometimes does that as well. And so as we talk about plot, we want to be paying attention to what's going on. Just like in drama, you not only have plot, but you have character. You have people who are doing the action of the story, who populate the world in which the story is set. And again, when you have character, the main character who is trying to accomplish something is the protagonist, and a character or thing, and sometimes a character is not a person. Character can be an animal, a character, and the antagonist is the character or thing that's preventing the protagonist from accomplishing his or her purposes. Sometimes those can be, like I say, they can be animals, they could be a thing, they could be an idea, they could be a society, they could be any number of things. And so you want to think and realize that sometimes characters are not always referring to people, especially in a lot of modern fiction, which tends to be a little bit on the more abstract side of things, or have more abstract kinds of character in it. Characters can also be well-rounded characters, what we call three-dimensional characters, in which you get the sense that this is a real person. They're not flat. That's the opposite of being a three-dimensional character. If a character is flat or one-dimensional, there's really only one thing about them. If they're bad, they're completely bad. They're just awful. And there are no redeeming qualities about them. You don't even understand why they're bad. They're just bad. They're not really very well developed. You don't get to know much about them. You don't get to understand much about them as a character. You almost feel like they're more a piece of furniture in the story, just there for the convenience of what they have to do, and then you dismiss them and throw them away. Well-developed characters are complicated. They're complex. They're three-dimensional or well-rounded. You begin to understand a little bit of why they are the way they are. You may not like them any better, but at least you begin to get a sense that this is a real person with actual motivations that are understandable, even though they may be despicable, but at least they're understandable as to why they do what they do in the story. Just like in drama, you want to pay attention not only to the action that's taking place and the characters that populate the story, you want to pay attention to where the story takes place, also known as the setting. Writers, just like playwrights, but writers of fiction, put their stories in places for a reason. They put them in particular countries at particular periods of history. They put them in certain rooms or buildings or types of structures. They tell a story that takes place in a city as opposed to out in the country for a particular reason. Those are not accidental, or if the writing is good, they're not accidental. And so as you're reading about and thinking about fiction, you want to think about, why did the writer make this choice? What is it about where this story takes place that is important, that it takes place here at this particular time, in this cultural setting, in this geographical setting, in this historical setting? Just as we talked about theme related to drama and theme related to poetry, want to make sure that we're paying attention to themes that appear in a work of fiction, whether that is a short story, whether it's a large novel. And again, theme has to do with big ideas, big concepts about human experience. For example, in the great American novel Moby Dick, with the character Captain Ahab and the main character or protagonist Ishmael, who is also the narrator of the story. Um, Themes of redemption, sin, forgiveness, uh, hatred, death, all of those themes are covered in the ideas and in the action that takes place and how the action gets carried out during the story, the interrelationships between the characters, how they speak to one another, how they treat one another. All of those things begin to be addressed. And so you always want to be making sure that you're looking at not just what's going on right in front of your face, the action or the plot, or the characters or the setting. You want to dig a little bit deeper to get into exploring themes and big picture ideas about what's happening in a story. The next three elements of composition for fiction we're going to deal with very, very quickly because we've already dealt with them elsewhere. Tone simply is the emotional feel of the story. Sometimes a writer tells a story in such a way that it's intended to be lighthearted and funny. That's a particular tone. In other times, a story is told in a way that is heavy and brooding. I mentioned the great American novel Moby Dick, which has a very dark tone, a heavy tone, which matches the themes and the nature of the story and is expressed through the characters. All of that comes together to create an emotional feeling that is just overpowering to this huge novel, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And so that emotional feel is what we refer to as the tone created by the writer. Imagery and symbol, again, we dealt with under poetry. Again, this is when a writer uses particular objects or the description of a place and gives you a mental word picture of something, but the word picture is actually communicating an idea that is something other than the object right in front of you. So if a writer spends a lot of time describing a tree, you might ask yourself, why spend so much time writing about this tree? What is it that makes this tree important? What is it about the description that suggests some larger ideas, some larger meaning to it? The same thing with a symbol, where a tree or a ring, or, for instance, in the Lord of the Rings, the ring itself, the ring of power, becomes a symbol for sin, for evil in the world, for controlling nature in the world. And so these symbols in the story were meant by the writer J.R.R. Tolkien to express ideas about our world, our experience as human beings. Our final element in taking a look at fiction is really one of the things, maybe the thing, that sets fiction apart from either poetry or from drama. Both fiction and drama tell stories. But when you are watching a drama, you are seeing the action unfold right in front of you. You don't need to have someone tell you what is happening or narrate the story. You can see it for yourself. That's not the case in fiction. In fiction, someone has to narrate, and every narrator tells the story from a particular point of view, and that is a key element in understanding fiction. Writers choose who is going to tell the story. Sometimes the narrator is one of the characters in the story. Sometimes the main character, maybe another character. Sometimes it's the antagonist. But if it's If it's a character in the story, then we talk about that narrator being a limited knowledge narrator. They only know what someone inside the story can know. They may not know as much as the reader knows based on what the reader brings to reading the story and what the reader sees as happening that even the narrator doesn't see happening in the story. At other times, the narrator might be someone outside of the story, what's called an all-knowing or omniscient point of view, where the narrator not only knows what's going on, the narrator has the ability to go inside and tell you about the ideas and thoughts and feelings of one or more of the characters in a way that no one inside the story could do that. Sometimes writers change the narrator. They change the point of view. This is more common with modern fiction, but still, someone begins telling the story, and then all of a sudden you get several chapters in and you suddenly realize that somebody else in the story is now telling the story of what's going on, because the person you thought was telling the story couldn't possibly know what was just said. And the narrator or the writer won't tell you that he or she has changed the narrator. That's part of the experience, of the artfulness of it. It can also be very, very frustrating. Sometimes it's hard, if not impossible, to tell for sure who is telling the story, what point of view is being expressed. But you always want to be asking the question, who's telling the story? What does this narrator know? What does this narrator not know? Another important question, is this narrator reliable? Is this narrator trustworthy? Is this narrator telling me the truth or trying to trick or lie to me? Yes, indeed. Writers will make some of their narrators not trustworthy. You have to read beyond what they tell you, look at what's happening, draw your own conclusions. Again, that's part of a much deeper experience of the story or the book that you're reading. So we've covered a lot of territory in this lecture dealing with poetry and fiction. And again, the whole purpose of this is to give you some ideas, to give you some tools, give you some understanding, not only in terms of things that you read as part of the weekly assignments for the course, but should you choose to use a piece of literature or a part of a piece of literature as the subject matter for your Experiencing the Humanities project and essay, this will give you some tools and some things you want to be paying special attention to as you go about that. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. What I really hope is that it might encourage you, create a little bit of hunger in you to take some additional coursework in literature. Take an introduction to a literature course. Read some things that you might not otherwise read and begin to read them in some different ways. Literature has been one of the primary ways in which men and women have sought to express themselves, their ideas and their thoughts and their understandings of their own human experience and the human experience of all of us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next lecture.